And so there is a connection between being open-hearted towards people and receiving the word and the gift of God. And we can't ignore that connection. Following Jesus means being as open-hearted towards people as he would be. Well, hello, and welcome to Sunday Morning with Hope Valley. My name is Sam. I'm the lead pastor here at Hope Valley House Churches, and today we are continuing in our study through the book of Acts. Today we're actually going to be in Acts chapter 21, picking up in verse 27, and we're going to be reading all the way to chapter 22, concluding in verse 22 there. So before we get into today's lesson, I just want to bring you back to the weekly application question from the last lesson. Each week we try and take a question with us into the week so we can challenge ourselves to actually do the things that we are learning. And the question from last week was, how is God calling you to make yourself a slave to everyone this week? I know that sounds frightening, right? But you want to reference 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 to 21, and you'll see what we're talking about there, right? How is God challenging you to do that? So if you're in a group setting, now would be a great time to stop the recording and to discuss that, share some testimonies, some progress, and that kind of thing before we continue. So as we get into today's lesson, let me give you some introductory information to get you just kind of caught up with where we are in the story of Acts. Peter has concluded his third missionary journey in the book of Acts and returned to Jerusalem. After arriving and sharing his reports with the elders of the church in Jerusalem, they had raised a concern that the Christian Jews in Jerusalem had been hearing these really terrible rumors that Paul had been instructing Jews in these other Gentile countries to just go ahead and abandon Jewish traditions and customs and the whole law of Moses. And the elders didn't seem to think that this was true, but they had advised Paul to prove it was false by sponsoring and joining with 4 men who were completing the rituals of a Jewish vow. It was possibly a Nazirite vow, but Luke doesn't say which vow it was. Paul had agreed to this, and now we're picking up in verse 27 of Acts 21, just as this ritual is nearly complete on the temple grounds. So as we pick up in verse 27 today, again, we're going to be reading all the way down to Acts chapter 22, verse 22. The question to have in your mind as we go is, what does hating other people, do to our relationship with God? So what does hating others do to our relationship with God? Let's pick up here in verse 27. It says, when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd, and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. What's more, he has also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul, and they had supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was stirred up, and the people rushed together. They seized Paul, dragging him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were trying to kill him, word went up to the commander of the regiment that all Jerusalem was in chaos. Taking along soldiers and centurions, he immediately ran down to them. Seeing the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander approached him, took him into custody, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He asked who he was and what he had done, and some of the crowd were shouting one thing and some another. Since he was not able to get reliable information because of the uproar, he ordered him to be taken into the barracks. And when Paul got to the steps, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd, for the mass of people followed, yelling, "Get rid of him." And as he was about to be brought into the barracks, Paul said to the commander, "Am I allowed to say something to you?" And he replied, "You know how to speak Greek? Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt some time ago and led 4,000 men of the assassins into the wilderness?" Paul said, "I'm a Jewish man from Tarsus of Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. Now I ask you, let me speak to the people." And after he had given permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned with his hands to the people, and when there was a great hush, he addressed them in Aramaic. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense before you. And when they heard that he was addressing them in Aramaic, they became even quieter. And he continued, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strictness of our ancestral law. And I was jealous for God, just as all of you are today. I persecuted this way to the death. He's talking about Christianity. Arresting and putting both men and women in jail, as both the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. After I received letters from them to the brothers, I traveled to Damascus to arrest those who were there and bring them to Jerusalem to be punished. And as I was traveling and approaching Damascus, about noon, an intense light from heaven suddenly flashed around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, the one you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but they did not hear the voice or the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What should I do, Lord? The Lord told me, Get up and go into Damascus, and there you will be told everything that you have been assigned to do. And since I couldn't see because of the brightness of the light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and I went into Damascus. And someone named Ananias, a devout man according to the law, who had a good reputation with all the Jews living there, came and stood by me and said, Brother Saul, regain your sight. And in that very hour I looked up and I saw him. And he said, The God of our ancestors has appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear the words from his mouth, since you will be a witness for him to all the people of what you have seen and heard. And now, why are you delaying? Get up and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on his name. And after I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance, and I saw him telling me, Hurry and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. But I said, Lord, they know that in synagogue after synagogue I had those who believed in you imprisoned and beaten. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I stood there giving approval and guarding the clothes of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, because I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And they listened to him up until this point. Then they raised their voices, shouting, Wipe this man off the face of the earth. He should not be allowed to live. Okay, so we've read a lot there. What are some key points in this passage? The first thing here is that we saw that the unbelieving Jews are triggered by seeing Paul associate with Gentiles, right? And we can, not just because of their own laws and customs, but probably because of also their experience, we can see how over the generations the Jews had turned the commands to be distinct from the Gentiles. You can think back to Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 through 6. You can go read that. They had this command to be distinct from the Gentiles, and many commands like that. But they had turned that command into hatred of the Gentiles. And this had only been really amplified by centuries of oppression from other countries, and up to and including the current oppression from Rome, right? I mean, keep in mind, not only has this been building, frankly, for centuries of their experience with other Gentile nations and losing battles and being oppressed, but they're currently under the oppression of Rome, which is a Gentile empire, right? And so we can see that over generations they had turned these commands to be distinct from the Gentiles into really what amounted to hatred for the Gentiles. And in their anger, the Jews jumped to conclusions and they took action, right? Verse 29 said they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul, right? And they had supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. So Paul knew better. Paul didn't bring Trophimus into the temple grounds. He knew it wasn't lawful for a Gentile to come into the temple court. And nobody had actually seen him do it. But they saw Paul, they had seen him earlier in the city with a Gentile, and they go, he probably brought him in. And so they jump to conclusions and they take action. By the way, the correct action for this would have been the death penalty, which is why they were trying to kill Paul, right? And this is actually a clear example of how hatred and resentment can make you imagine the worst in others, right? It's a really clear example of that, something we need to think about as we go through today's lesson. And so the second big point we see here is that Paul explains that he was being faithful to God by embracing the Gentiles. As you can imagine, that's a pretty offensive concept for these unbelieving Jews, right? But that's what Paul's explaining. First, he lays out his proven track record of faithfulness to the Jewish God and to the credibility of his revelation of Jesus. Right in verse 3, he tells them, I'm a Jew. I was born in Tarsus. I was brought up in the city. I was educated by Gamaliel according to the strictness of our ancestral law. I was zealous for God just like you guys are. And then in verse 12, he said about Ananias, right, in Damascus, he said, Ananias was a devout man according to the law. Right? So the person who came and helped him understand the revelation of Jesus and gave more revelation to him from what God was saying was himself a devout Jewish man who strictly followed the Jewish law, right? And he had a good reputation, it says here in verse 12, he had a good reputation of all the Jews living there. And he came and he stood by me. The God of our ancestors has appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, that's Jesus, and to hear the words from his mouth. And so Paul is laying out his proven track record and the credibility of the revelation that he had from Jesus as being a revelation from the God of Israel, right? And then we see that Paul explains that going to the Gentiles was actually an act of obedience to God and a response to the Jews' own rejection of God's message. And as we saw, that didn't go over well, right? In verse 17, he said, after I returned to Jerusalem, Jesus told me, get up and hurry out of Jerusalem because they won't accept your testimony, and I'm going to send you far away to the Gentiles. And so in other words, Paul was actually, his argument to the crowd was, I'm not being unfaithful to God. It's actually you, the unbelieving Jews of Jerusalem. You're the ones being unfaithful to God. And now God is turning to the Gentiles as a result of your unwillingness to listen. This was absolutely true, by the way, and like many things, it was also incredibly offensive to hear, right? I think we can relate to that. Things that are absolutely true can also be incredibly offensive to hear, and often are, right? And so that's what happened. And so the unbelieving Jews, here's the final main point, the unbelieving Jews cannot accept God's invitation to the Gentiles. They can't accept that because the Jews in the story had many barriers that made it impossible for them to accept what God was saying, right? And we saw this in verse 22. It says they listened, like they actually were quiet and they listened to Paul up until this point. But then at that point, when Paul essentially says, I'm not being unfaithful, you've been unfaithful, and because of your unfaithfulness, God is actually reaching out to the Gentiles because you slapped his hand away. And when he said that, they go, okay, we're done listening. Wipe this man off the face of the earth. He should not be allowed to live, right? And so they shared this cultural experience, right? They shared this cultural experience of generations of war with the Gentiles and suffering under the hand of other Gentiles. They had perverted these commands to be separate and distinct from the Gentiles into what really amounted to hatred. And so their shared cultural experience and their present circumstance, what did it do? It filled them with resentment, isolationism, pride, bitterness, and anger, just to name a few, right? And these feelings and values make it impossible to be open to change, to humility, and to the embrace of others. And so this is why we see Jesus back in the Gospels. He's constantly rebuking the unbelieving Jews for having hard hearts. And we see this in Matthew. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 14 to 15, this is what Jesus had said to these same people in Jerusalem. He said, Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in them, which says, you will listen and listen, but never understand. And you will look and look, but you'll never perceive. For this people's heart has grown callous, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn back, and I would heal them. So this is a prophecy from Isaiah, and Jesus quotes it about the people of Jerusalem, and he says, what Isaiah said is indeed true, right? They've become hard-hearted, they've become callous, and they're unable to understand, they're unable to receive anything from God anymore. And we're seeing that once again on display here with Paul and the crowd. All right, so we're going to stop there for today. Let me give you some questions to think about and to go deeper with. If you're in a group setting, it'd be great to pause the recording here in a moment and discuss these, dig a little bit deeper together. If you're by yourself, I would encourage you to journal on these questions and dig deeper that way. But let me give you these questions. First question for today to discuss and think about: how can you relate to the hard hearts of the Jews in the story? It's pretty easy to make them like the bad guys, but actually they're not that different from the rest of us. So how can we relate to the hard hearts of the Jews in the story? Do you see a version of their attitude in your own heart towards anyone or any groups of people even, right? How does having a hard heart towards others affect our experience of God? Okay. And the third question is, why is God more open-hearted toward people than you are? Or we can say than we are, right? You might immediately have like 5 very obvious answers, starting with, well, he's God and he's perfect. But I really encourage you to dig deeper past the obvious answers and really explore that question together, especially in a group setting. It'd be a great thing to really explore together. Why is God more open-hearted toward people than we are? All right, let's think about that. Let me just give you just kind of a closing statement here where I would just like to land the plane of today's lesson. You know, when we hold on to offense and pride and bitterness, our hearts begin to close. And when we close our heart towards some people, we will begin to reject what God Himself desires for them. And when we do that, we begin to reject God Himself and cut ourselves off from His blessings. This is what we saw happen with these unbelieving Jews in Jerusalem. And so there is a connection between being open-hearted towards people and receiving the word and the gift of God. And we can't ignore that connection. Following Jesus means being as open-hearted towards people as He would be in our exact situation. Okay? So, again, every week we kind of want to take a question with us into the week so we can practice and work on actually doing the things that we're learning. And so the application question for this week is, what person or groups of people do you need to open your heart to this week? And what will be your first step? What person or groups of people do you need to open your heart to this week? And what will be your first step? Okay, take that question into the week. And then I just encourage you, once the lesson's over today, take some time and pray. Ask the Lord to show us where we are holding on to the things that are making our hearts hard. And ask Him to show us our next step to open our hearts again. You know, frankly, sometimes our hearts are hard and it's been so long and it's become so normal to us that we don't even know why our hearts are hard anymore. We're not even sure what we're angry and bitter about because we've allowed bitterness and anger to just fester in our soul for way too long. And so it'd be good to spend time in prayer today and ask the Lord, maybe I don't even know why my heart is so hard. Lord, will you show me that? And show me what are my next practical steps to open my heart again, soften my heart again towards other people. All right. Just encourage you to do that and to spend that time in prayer. I hope this has been helpful for you and a blessing, and I hope that you'll continue with us as we study through the book of Acts. We're coming up close to the end. We probably have 4 or 5 lessons left. The last several chapters of Acts move a little bit more quickly, and so we'll be on to the conclusion of Acts here sooner than you might think. So hope that you'll continue with us as we conclude our study through the book of Acts here in the next 2 months. And in the meantime, pray that God will bless you and that you have a great week. And thanks for being here. Bye.
We are so glad you have joined us today. To learn more about Hope Valley Church and get access to free resources, just go to www.hopevalley.church. There, you will also find links to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, as well as links to our podcasts, now available on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you can stay up with new videos coming out every week. Hope Valley is a church based in Winchester, Virginia that meets in homes around the region. So if you'd like to find out more about home churches, how they work, and how to locate one near you, just go to hopevalley.church/house. Thanks again for joining us, and may God bless you today.